The thunderous crack of a revolver split the morning air over Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1874. And like most trouble in town, it traced back to that surly bastard Mason Wade. Standing rigid in the dusty thoroughfare, Mason holstered his smoking Colt, his face an emotionless mask as he stared down at the would-be bushwhacker who'd made the grave mistake of trying to collect the bounty on his head. Anyone else? Mason growled, his steel-gray eyes scanning the boardwalk where onlookers shrank back into doorways. No one met his gaze. No one ever did anymore. The undertaker emerged from his shop with a resigned sigh. "That's the third one this month, Wade." Mason didn't bother responding. He simply adjusted his black Stetson and strode toward the saloon, spurs jingling with each step. The crowd parted before him like water breaking against stone. Behind his back, the whispers started the same ones that had followed him for 5 years. "That's him, the one they call Stone Face. Ain't smiled since his wife and boy died in '69. Too angry for anything but trouble. Too angry even for love." Mason heard them but gave no indication. Let them talk. Words were just noise, and noise couldn't hurt a dead man walking. Inside the Golden Nugget Saloon, Mason claimed his usual corner table, back to the wall, facing the entrance. The bartender placed a bottle of whiskey before him without being asked, then retreated with hasty steps. Mason poured himself a generous measure and sat alone, as he had done every day since returning to Bitter Creek. 5 years earlier, Mason had been a different man, a ranch owner with a pretty wife, a 3-year-old son, and a future as bright as Wyoming sunshine. Then came the fever that swept through the territory like wildfire. By the time it passed, Mason had buried everything he'd ever loved in a small plot of land overlooking the valley. He'd sold the ranch, strapped on a gun, and drifted, taking work as a bounty hunter, hired gun, whatever paid and didn't require him to feel. His reputation grew as quickly as the notches on his gun. They said he couldn't be killed because he was already dead inside. Mason never bothered to correct them. The saloon doors swung open, momentarily flooding the dim interior with harsh sunlight. Mason's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, then relaxed as a woman entered. She was unfamiliar, a rarity in Bitter Creek, dressed in practical riding clothes rather than the gaudy attire of saloon girls. Her auburn hair was pinned beneath a sensible hat, and she carried herself with the confident posture of someone who knew her own mind. The woman approached the bar and spoke briefly with the bartender, who gestured reluctantly in Mason's direction. Mason scowled as she turned toward his table. Unwanted company was still unwanted, even if it came in an attractive package, Mr. Wade. The woman stood before him, clutching a leather satchel. "My name is Eleanor Zachary. I've been told you're the man to see about safe passage to Laramie." Mason took a slow sip of whiskey. "You've been told wrong. I'm prepared to pay generously." She placed a small pouch on the table. The unmistakable clink of gold coins followed. Not interested. Eleanor Zachary didn't move. "The stage isn't due for another 2 weeks. I need to reach Laramie within 5 days. "That sounds like your problem, not mine." Mason refilled his glass, deliberately ignoring her. "I've been informed that you know this territory better than anyone, that you can navigate routes others wouldn't dare attempt." Mason looked up sharply. "Who told you that, Marshal Donnelly?" Mason snorted. "Donnelly would like nothing better than to see me with an arrow in my back out in Sioux territory. He also mentioned you were difficult." For the first time, a hint of frustration colored her voice. "But he said you were the only one who could get me there alive if the Blackwood gang is truly back in these parts." Mason's expression darkened at the mention of the Blackwood gang. 3 years prior, he'd helped track down their leader, Jeb Harker, after they'd raided 6 settlements across the territory. Harker had sworn vengeance while being led to the gallows. If his remaining men were indeed regrouping, that explained the recent attempts on Mason's life. "Why Laramie?" he asked, curiosity momentarily overriding his desire to be left alone. "I'm a schoolteacher." I've been hired to establish a school there before winter sets in. Mason studied her more carefully. Her hands, though clean, showed signs of work. Her clothing was quality but well worn. Most tellingly, her green eyes met his without wavering, a rare occurrence in his experience these days. $500, he said finally. Half now, half when we arrive. We leave at dawn and you follow my orders without question. First sign of trouble, I'll leave you behind. Eleanor nodded. I'll be ready. She opened her satchel, counted out half the agreed sum, and placed it beside the pouch. Where shall I meet you? Livery stable, and pack light. Where we're going, every pound matters. As she turned to leave, Mason added, and Miss Zachary. If this is some elaborate scheme to collect my bounty, you should know I've killed better liars than you. Eleanor paused, looking back over her shoulder. I'm a schoolteacher, Mr. Wade, not an assassin. Though after speaking with you, I'm beginning to wonder which occupation requires more courage. With that, she walked out, leaving Mason momentarily taken aback. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to him as a person rather than a legend or a monster. Mason wasn't sure he liked it. The next morning arrived cold and gray, with a hint of impending snow on the wind. Mason waited by the livery stable, 2 horses saddled and ready, provisions packed. He'd spent most of the night planning their route, one that would avoid the main trails where the Blackwood gang might be watching. He was mildly surprised when Eleanor appeared precisely at dawn, dressed in sturdy riding clothes and carrying a single small trunk. Her punctuality was the first test passed. The ability to ride would be the second. Good morning, Mr. Wade. She approached the horses with confidence. Mason nodded curtly and indicated the smaller of the 2 mounts, a dun mare with a gentle disposition. This one's yours. Can you ride? Since I was 6, Eleanor replied, running a practiced hand down the mare's neck before checking the cinch on the saddle. The horse nickered softly, seeming to approve of her touch. We'll ride northwest to throw off anyone watching, then cut east through Rattlesnake Pass, Mason explained, securing her trunk to the packhorse. It'll add a day to the journey, but it's safer than the main trail. I defer to your expertise, Eleanor said, mounting smoothly. Again, Mason noted with grudging approval she'd passed another test. Perhaps this wouldn't be as troublesome as he'd anticipated. They rode in silence for the first few hours, leaving Bitter Creek behind and entering the rolling prairie that stretched toward distant mountains. Mason set a steady pace, occasionally glancing back to ensure Eleanor was keeping up. To his mild surprise, she rode well, sitting her horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent considerable time in the saddle. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon. Mason led them to a small stand of cottonwoods beside a creek for a brief rest. As they dismounted, Eleanor winced slightly. Problem? Mason asked, more from concern about delays than genuine interest in her comfort. Nothing serious. It's been some time since I've ridden this distance. She stretched discreetly. Mason handed her a strip of jerky and a canteen. We've got another 4 hours before making camp. If you need to stop, say so. I won't have you falling off your horse and breaking your neck. That would be an inconvenience. Eleanor accepted the food with a faint smile. Your concern is touching. It's practical, not touching. Dead clients don't pay the second half, of course. She took a sip from the canteen, studying him openly. May I ask you something, Mr. Wade? You can ask. I might not answer. How did you come to know this territory so well? Mason considered ignoring the question, but there was no harm in basic facts. I ran cattle through these parts for 8 years, had a spread about 30 miles east of Bitter Creek. And now you're a guide and, what else exactly? Whatever pays. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. The marshal mentioned you were once a family man. Mason's expression hardened instantly. He snatched the canteen back, capping it with unnecessary force. Rest time's over. We need to make it to Serpent's Ridge by nightfall. They mounted up and continued riding, the silence between them now heavy with tension. Mason led them across increasingly rugged terrain, pushing the pace just enough to discourage further conversation. By late afternoon, fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a steady downpour. "There's a line shack about a mile ahead," Mason called over his shoulder, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "We'll stop there." The abandoned herder's cabin was little more than a one-room shelter with a sagging roof, but it was dry inside. Mason quickly built a fire in the small stone hearth while Eleanor tended to the horses in the lean-to at the back. When she returned, her clothes were soaked through, and she was shivering despite her efforts to hide it. Mason wordlessly handed her a blanket from his pack. "Thank you," she said, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Will this rain delay us significantly? Depends how long it lasts. The creek at Rattlesnake Pass floods easily." Mason placed a small coffee pot near the fire. "Might need to take the high trail if it does. That adds another day." Eleanor nodded, moving closer to the fire. "I appreciate your thoroughness in planning alternatives." Mason shrugged. "It's why you're paying me." They ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack in relative silence, the rain drumming steadily on the roof. As darkness fell outside, Mason noticed Eleanor removing a book from her satchel. "You always travel with reading material?" he asked, curious despite himself. "Always. This one is for the older students I'll be teaching." She held up a well-worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans. "Bit fancy for frontier kids, isn't it?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "Perhaps, but I believe in setting high expectations." She ran her fingers along the book's spine. "Besides, stories of courage and perseverance seem particularly appropriate for children growing up in such challenging surroundings." Mason grunted noncommittally and busied himself checking his revolver. After a moment, Eleanor spoke again. "Would you like me to read some of it? The rain doesn't seem to be letting up and the evening stretches before us." "I can read," Mason replied gruffly. "I didn't suggest otherwise." "I merely thought it might pass the time." Mason hesitated. It had been years since anyone had offered to read to him. The last time had been Sarah, his wife, reading to their son while Mason listened from his chair by the fire. The memory stung unexpectedly. "Suit yourself," he finally said, leaning back against the wall and closing his eyes. Eleanor began to read, her voice clear and expressive as she narrated Hawkeye and Chingachgook's adventures. Despite himself, Mason found the tension in his shoulders gradually easing as the story unfolded. When she paused after a chapter, he opened his eyes to find her watching him. "Would you like me to continue?" she asked. Mason cleared his throat. "If you want, I'm keeping watch anyway." She smiled slightly and resumed reading. Eventually, her voice grew tired and she marked her place in the book. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be demanding if we're to make up time," she said. Mason nodded. "Take the cot, I'll sleep by the fire." "That hardly seems fair." "I wasn't offering a choice." "I sleep light and need to be by the door." Eleanor considered arguing but recognized the practicality of his arrangement. She settled onto the narrow cot, pulling her blanket close. "Good night, Mr. Wade. Get some sleep, Miss Zachary." Mason stayed awake long after her breathing deepened into sleep, listening to the rain and wondering why he'd allowed the simple comfort of a story to affect him. Weakness, he decided. A momentary lapse he couldn't afford to repeat. Dawn brought clearing skies but confirmed Mason's concerns about flooding. They set out early, Mason leading them away from the planned route toward a steeper, more challenging trail that would take them above the flood-prone areas. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they climbed. Narrow paths skirted steep drop-offs, and loose shale made footing treacherous for the horses. Eleanor followed Mason's lead without complaint, even when the path grew so narrow they had to dismount and lead the animals. "Stop here," Mason instructed as they reached a precarious section. "I need to check if it's passable." He moved ahead cautiously, testing the path. A recent slide had taken out part of the trail, leaving barely enough room for a horse to pass. As he was assessing the situation, a distant sound caught his attention, horses approaching from below. Mason hurried back to Eleanor. "Someone's coming. Could be nothing, but we can't risk it. We need to cross now." Is it safe? Safe enough if we're careful. I'll lead my horse first, then come back for yours. Mason navigated the dangerous section slowly, keeping his mount close to the cliff face. Once across, he secured his horse and returned for Eleanor's. Stay close to the wall and don't look down, he instructed, taking the mare's reins. Eleanor followed his directions precisely, placing her feet where he indicated and keeping her eyes fixed on the path ahead. When a small section crumbled beneath her boot, she gasped but didn't panic, quickly regaining her footing. "Steady," Mason murmured, the gentlest his voice had been since they'd met. They made it across just as the riders below came into view, 5 men, heavily armed, moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of travelers. Blackwood Gang. Eleanor whispered as Mason pulled her behind an outcropping. "Looks like, recognize 2 of them." Mason peered carefully around the rock. "They're following our trail from yesterday. Will they pursue us up here? Not if they have any sense. This trail's barely passable in good conditions." Mason watched as the men below conferred, then continued along the lower path. "But they know where we're headed. We'll need to change our plans again." They waited until the riders disappeared from view before continuing, now moving with greater urgency. By late afternoon, they'd reached a high meadow surrounded by pine forest. "We'll camp here tonight," Mason decided. "There's good cover, and we can see anyone approaching from below." As they set up camp, Eleanor seemed unusually quiet. Mason noticed her wincing as she unsaddled her horse. "You're hurt," he observed flatly. "It's nothing serious, just a bruise from when I slipped on the trail." Mason frowned. "Let me see." "That's hardly necessary. It is if it's going to slow us down tomorrow. We've got harder riding ahead." Eleanor reluctantly showed him her arm, where a dark bruise was forming from wrist to elbow. Mason examined it with clinical detachment. "Not broken. Apply this." He handed her a small tin of salve from his saddlebag. "It'll help with the swelling." "Thank you." She applied the ointment, watching as Mason efficiently arranged their campsite. "You've done this many times before. Living outdoors is the same whether you're driving cattle or tracking bounties." "Is that what you do now, hunt bounties?" Mason stiffened. "Sometimes." "The men following us, is there a bounty on them?" "Yes, but that's not why they're after us. They're after me." Mason busied himself building a small, nearly smokeless fire. "Their leader and I have history." "What kind of history?" Mason's jaw tightened. "The kind that ends with someone dead." Eleanor fell silent, seeming to sense she'd pushed too far. As darkness fell, they ate another simple meal. Afterward, Eleanor reached for her book. "Would you like me to continue reading?" she asked cautiously. Mason hesitated, then nodded once. "Might as well." She read for nearly an hour, her voice soft in the quiet mountain air. When she described a particularly daring rescue in the story, Mason found himself genuinely engaged, leaning forward slightly. "That part always struck me as improbable," he commented when she paused. Eleanor looked up, surprised by his engagement. Which aspect? Hawkeye making that shot in those conditions. Even the best marksman would struggle with that distance in poor light. "Perhaps Fenimore Cooper took some literary license," Eleanor suggested, a small smile playing at her lips. "Have you read it before?" "A long time ago," Mason admitted, suddenly uncomfortable with the personal nature of the conversation. He stood abruptly. "We should sleep. I'll take first watch." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Wake me for the second watch. You need rest too." "I've gone longer without sleep." "That doesn't mean you should. We have 3 more days of difficult travel ahead." Mason couldn't argue with her logic, though he was unaccustomed to anyone showing concern for his well-being. "Fine, I'll wake you in 4 hours." As promised, Mason roused Eleanor for her watch, though he slept lightly, hand never far from his revolver. At dawn, they set out again, now cutting northeast through dense forest rather than continuing along their planned route. The day passed without incident, but Mason's vigilance never wavered. He chose their path carefully, avoiding open ground when possible and frequently checking for signs of pursuit. By late afternoon, they emerged from the forest onto a vast prairie that stretched eastward toward distant hills. We'll have to cross tonight, Mason explained, surveying the open terrain. Too exposed during daylight, Eleanor nodded, understanding the strategy. Will we reach Laramie tomorrow, day after? If we're not delayed, we'll need to rest the horses after crossing the prairie. They made camp at the forest edge, waiting for darkness before attempting the crossing. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vivid oranges and purples, Eleanor stood gazing at the view. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Mason glanced up, following her gaze. He hadn't noticed a sunset, truly noticed one in years. "I suppose it is. What made you stay in Wyoming after?" "Everything," Eleanor asked cautiously. Most men would have sought a fresh start elsewhere. Mason was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "They're buried here. Sarah and James couldn't leave them alone." Eleanor's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Wade." "Mason, pardon, my name is Mason. If we're going to spend the night crossing open territory with armed men possibly hunting us, you might as well use my name." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Mason, then, and I'm Eleanor." Something shifted between them in that moment, not friendship exactly, but a tentative truce. When darkness fell, they set out across the prairie, riding side by side under a canopy of stars. "The Sioux called this the Buffalo Road," Mason said unexpectedly as they rode. "Herds used to blacken the prairie from horizon to horizon." "And now?" Eleanor asked, "mostly gone." "Between the hide hunters and the railroad, they didn't stand a chance." "That seems a terrible loss." Mason glanced at her. "Most folks call it progress. Progress should build upon what came before, not destroy it," Eleanor replied thoughtfully. Mason considered this. "Sounds like something Sarah would have said. She never saw much sense in tearing down just because something was old or different. She sounds like a wise woman." She was. To his surprise, Mason found it didn't hurt quite as much to speak of her. "Smart as a whip. Could outride most men and still have dinner on the table by sundown." Eleanor smiled. "And your son, what was he like, James?" "He was." Mason's voice caught unexpectedly. "He was just starting to be a real person, you know, not just a baby anymore, had opinions about everything. Stubborn as a mule, even at 3. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips at the memory. "Loved horses. Used to sit him on my saddle before he could even walk." "You must have been a wonderful father." Mason's expression darkened. "Not wonderful enough to save them. The fever took many lives that year, my own sister included," Eleanor said softly. "Some things are beyond our control, no matter how much we wish otherwise." Mason fell silent, processing her words. They rode without speaking for several hours, crossing the vast prairie under moonlight. Near dawn, they reached a small creek with a grove of trees, enough shelter to rest during daylight. As they cared for the horses, Mason noticed Eleanor seemed unsteady on her feet. "When did you last sleep properly?" he asked. "I'm fine." "That wasn't my question." Eleanor sighed. "Before we left Bitter Creek, I suppose. I find it difficult to sleep deeply when traveling." "You need rest. I'll keep watch." "You've barely slept yourself," she protested. "I'm used to it." Eleanor wanted to argue but was clearly exhausted. "Wake me if there's any sign of trouble." "I will." She settled beneath a tree, using her saddle as a pillow. Mason positioned himself where he could see both her and the approach to their small camp. As she drifted off to sleep, he found himself studying her face, relaxed now in slumber. There was a strength to her features that matched her character, determined, yet kind, intelligent, but not cold. For the first time in years, Mason felt something stir within him that wasn't anger or grief. The sensation was so unfamiliar that he almost didn't recognize it as admiration. The day passed quietly. When Eleanor awoke in the afternoon, Mason had coffee waiting. She accepted it gratefully. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, noticing the dark circles beneath his eyes. "Enough." Eleanor clearly didn't believe him but didn't press the issue. "How much further to Laramie?" "About 40 miles. We'll reach it tomorrow evening if we push hard." She nodded, sipping her coffee. I've been thinking about those men tracking us. Won't they eventually realize we've changed course? Already have, most likely, but they'll have to guess which way we went. That buys us time. And if they guess correctly, Mason's hand moved unconsciously to his revolver. Then I'll handle it. Eleanor studied him. You've killed many men, haven't you? Yes. Does it trouble you? Mason considered the question seriously. Not the ones who deserved it. Some did, some didn't. I try not to think about the second group. Yet you do, or you wouldn't have made the distinction, Eleanor observed. Mason gave her a sharp look. You ask a lot of questions for a schoolteacher. How do you think one becomes educated, if not by asking questions? There was a hint of challenge in her voice. To her surprise, Mason's mouth quirked slightly at one corner, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it she'd seen. Fair point. They set out again at dusk, now making good time across easier terrain. The moon was bright, illuminating their path clearly. As they rode, Eleanor continued their earlier conversation. What will you do after you deliver me to Laramie? Mason shrugged. Find another job. There's always someone needing protection or guidance through rough country. Have you ever considered a more settled existence? Had that once, didn't last. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen again, Eleanor ventured. Mason's expression closed off. Lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place. Actually, it does, Eleanor countered. Quite frequently, in fact, tall structures like church steeples are often struck multiple times. Mason stared at her for a moment, then made a sound that might have been the beginnings of a laugh before he caught himself. You're a peculiar woman, Eleanor Zachary. I'll take that as a compliment, coming from a man who communicates primarily in grunts and scowls. Mason actually blinked in surprise at her teasing. Before he could respond, a sound in the distance caught his attention. He raised a hand for silence, listening intently. Riders, he whispered, guiding his horse toward a copse of trees. At least 3, moving fast. They concealed themselves among the trees, watching as shadowy figures approached along the trail they'd been following. In the moonlight, Mason could make out 5 riders moving at a purposeful trot. It's them, he murmured. They've picked up our trail. What do we do? Eleanor whispered back. Wait until they pass, then double back and circle around them. There's a ravine about 2 miles east that leads to the old military road. We can make better time there. They waited in tense silence as the riders drew closer. Mason could now clearly see Harker leading the group, his distinctive silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light. The gang passed within 100 yards of their hiding place without slowing. Once the riders were well past, Mason led Eleanor in a wide arc that eventually brought them to a steep-sided ravine. They descended carefully, their horses picking their way down the rocky slope. The old road follows this ravine for about 10 miles, then emerges near Elk Creek, Mason explained. If we push hard, we can reach Laramie by tomorrow afternoon. They rode through the night, pushing the horses as much as was safe in the darkness. By dawn, they had gained considerable distance on their pursuers. They paused briefly to rest the animals, then continued on. As the sun climbed higher, the landscape began to change, transitioning from rugged hills to rolling grasslands. In the distance, the first outbuildings of Laramie became visible by mid-afternoon. We made it, Eleanor said with relief as the town proper came into view. Not quite yet, Mason cautioned. Still 3 miles of open ground to cover. As if to punctuate his warning, a shot rang out behind them. Mason turned to see dust rising from the hill they'd just descended. 5 riders were silhouetted against the sky, and even at this distance, he could see Harker pointing in their direction. Ride, Mason commanded, spurring his horse forward. Don't stop for anything. They galloped across the open prairie, horses straining with effort. Behind them, the Blackwood gang gave chase, gaining ground on fresher mounts. Another shot whistled past them, kicking up dirt near Eleanor's horse. Keep going, Mason shouted, dropping back slightly to place himself between Eleanor and the pursuers. He drew his revolver and fired twice, forcing their attackers to spread out. The town grew larger ahead of them, but the gang was closing the distance rapidly. Mason made a split-second decision. Ride straight for the marshal's office, he instructed Eleanor. I'll hold them off, Mason, no. Go, now. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before urging her horse forward. Mason wheeled his mount, facing the oncoming riders. He dismounted quickly, slapping his horse's flank to send it galloping after Eleanor. Using his saddle as a rest, he took careful aim. His first shot struck the lead rider's horse, sending both animal and rider tumbling. His second caught one of Harker's men in the shoulder. The remaining three, including Harker, scattered for cover behind a small rise. Mason knew he couldn't hold them off indefinitely, but he only needed to buy enough time for Eleanor to reach town and alert the marshal. He fired again when one of the men attempted to flank him, driving him back. Harker's voice carried across the distance. Give it up, Wade, you're outnumbered. Come and get me, Harker, Mason called back, shifting positions slightly. A furious exchange of gunfire followed, with Mason carefully conserving ammunition while keeping the gang pinned down. He was so focused on Harker and his visible men that he almost missed the third outlaw who had circled wide around the rise. The bullet struck Mason's left side, spinning him around. He fell hard but managed to roll behind a boulder, clutching his bleeding side. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he reloaded his revolver with his remaining cartridges. The sound of multiple horses approaching from the direction of town gave him a surge of hope. He risked a glance over the boulder to see the marshal and several deputies galloping toward them, Eleanor riding alongside. Harker and his remaining men, seeing the approaching lawmen, fired a few more shots before retreating toward the hills. Mason slumped against the rock, suddenly aware of how much blood he was losing. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and disconnected images. Eleanor's worried face above him, the town doctor probing his wound, the ceiling of a small bedroom spinning lazily as fever took hold. When Mason finally regained full consciousness, sunlight was streaming through unfamiliar curtains. He tried to sit up, gasping at the sharp pain in his side. Don't you dare tear those stitches, came Eleanor's stern voice from nearby. I didn't drag you back from death's door just to have you undo all our hard work. Mason turned his head to see her sitting in a chair beside the bed, a book open on her lap. Where am I? The doctor's house. You've been here for 3 days. 3 days. Mason attempted to sit up again, more carefully this time. Harker, captured along with one of his men. The third didn't survive. Marshal Donnelly is quite pleased with himself. Mason digested this information. And you, did you reach the school safely? Eleanor smiled. I did. Classes begin next week once I've finished setting up the schoolhouse. Good. Mason wasn't sure what else to say. Their journey was complete, their arrangement concluded. He felt an unexpected pang at the realization. I suppose I should settle my bill with the doctor and be on my way. You're not going anywhere for at least another week, Eleanor said firmly. Doctor's orders and mine. I've imposed on you enough. Imposed, Mason Wade, you saved my life. Taking care of you while you recover is the least I can do. Mason frowned. What about your school preparations? They can wait a few more days. Besides, she added, holding up her book, I still haven't finished reading you the story. We stopped right at a crucial moment. Despite himself, Mason felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with his injury. You don't need to keep me company. I'm sure you have more important matters to attend to. Perhaps I enjoy your company, Eleanor said simply. Gruff as it may be, Mason didn't know how to respond to that. No one had enjoyed his company in years. He'd made certain of it. Would you like me to continue reading? She asked. Mason nodded, settling back against the pillows. Eleanor resumed where they had left off, her voice bringing the story to life as she described a tense standoff between the main characters. When she reached a particularly clever bit of dialogue, Mason surprised them both by chuckling softly. Eleanor stopped reading, her eyes wide. What? Mason asked, suddenly self-conscious. You laughed, she said, a smile spreading across her face. I don't believe I've heard that sound from you before. Mason realized she was right. He couldn't remember the last time he'd truly laughed at anything. The realization should have saddened him, but instead, he found himself smiling faintly. I suppose the story is more amusing than I remembered. Or perhaps you're finally allowing yourself to enjoy something again, Eleanor suggested gently. Mason studied her face, the intelligence in her green eyes, the determined set of her chin, the kindness in her expression. Something long dormant stirred within him. Perhaps I am. Over the next 2 weeks, as Mason recovered, Eleanor visited daily. She would read to him, bring him news of the town, and gradually coax him into longer conversations. Sometimes they would argue good-naturedly about characters in the books she brought or debate the merits of different teaching approaches. To Mason's surprise, he found himself looking forward to her visits. More surprisingly still, he discovered he was capable of emotions beyond anger and grief. When Eleanor described her plans for the school, he offered practical suggestions for weatherproofing the building. When she expressed concern about reaching certain students, he found himself sharing stories of how his own schoolteacher had engaged even the most reluctant pupils. As his strength returned, Mason began taking short walks through town with Eleanor as his guide. The townspeople, who had initially regarded him with suspicion, gradually became accustomed to seeing the fearsome, stone-faced Wade strolling alongside their new schoolteacher, occasionally even smiling at something she said. On one such walk, as autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson, Eleanor asked the question that had been building between them. "What will you do now, Mason? Will you return to Bitter Creek?" Mason considered this, looking out toward the mountains. "I'm not sure there's anything for me there anymore." "And here?" Eleanor asked, her voice carefully neutral. Mason turned to face her, really seeing her the woman who had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself, who had made him laugh for the first time in years. "There might be," he said quietly, "if I had a reason to stay." Eleanor's cheeks flushed slightly. "Laramie is growing quickly. They'll need someone who knows the territory, who can guide newcomers safely, someone respected, even feared a little when necessary." "Are you offering me a job, Miss Zachary?" There was a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'm suggesting a possibility, Mr. Wade." She met his gaze steadily. "Among others." Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 long years, hope. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "I reckon I could stay a while," he said finally. "See how things develop." Eleanor smiled, her eyes bright. "I would like that very much." As they continued their walk, Mason's hand found hers. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they'd been doing this for years rather than minutes. For the first time since he'd lost his family, Mason felt like he might have found his way home. The following spring, when wildflowers carpeted the prairies around Laramie, Mason Wade no longer called Stone Face, but now known as the town's most reliable guide, and, surprisingly, assistant at the school's riding lessons, married Eleanor Zachary in a simple ceremony attended by most of the town. Their laughter, once so rare from Mason, became a familiar sound in Laramie. And when asked how she had accomplished what many thought impossible, Eleanor would simply smile and say, "I just reminded him that even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring."